Ladies and gentlemen, the time has finally arrived to talk about Cell's introduction into Dragon Ball Super Superhero. Even though that's like the worst title of all time because Superhero sounds redundant as hell, but we're here to be positive. We're not going to spill any negativity towards Dragon Ball Super today because we have nothing but positive things to talk about. So without wasting any more time, let's get straight into this video. We're going to talk about why Max Cell being added as a villain is a good thing and why it's good for the future of the Dragon Ball franchise as a whole. And for those of you who missed it out, Geekdom 101 did a whole news report himself talking about the details, so I will post the link in the description so you can find out more about the specific news itself while we talk more about the long-term consequences that this could have on Dragon Ball in a positive way. So, let's get the party started. So the first thing that we have to talk about in this video is being a little biased on the subject. So guys, let's be honest, compared to other Dragon Ball movies of the past, this movie is not getting quite the hype that a lot of those movies did, for very obvious reasons. Dragon Ball has been off the air for several years, some people might be a little off about the animation style, so on and so forth. Me personally, I think this is the most creative idea for a Dragon Ball movie I've seen probably in a very long time, and here's why. Piccolo and Gohan are my two favorite characters in the franchise, so just them being a major part of this movie itself is reason enough for me to want to watch this, right? And when you factor in that Cell is also my favorite villain of all time, I mean, for those of you who've played Legacy of Goku 2, you played Dragon Ball Budokai, you grew up with those early to mid 2000 games. I think for a lot of old school Dragon Ball fans, this is a really interesting Dragon Ball movie. So, getting the bias out of the way, the first thing we have to talk about is Android 17. Now, if you've been watching a lot of these Dragon Ball trailers and, news reports about the movie and such, there's been absolutely nothing said about Android 17, and if you see the concept or what Max Cell looks similar to with semi-perfect Cell, the first thing that I thought about, well, Android 17 isn't being shown in the movie. It would be kind of odd if he didn't show up at all, considering that 18 was revealed. And when you consider the fact that 17 and 18 are always synonymous with each other, in addition to the fact that they're both related to the Red Ribbon Army, in addition to the fact that 17 also helped during the Moro arc, so he's still an active fighting character also in the Tournament of Power, it kind of doesn't make sense for 17 to not be in the movie, which is why a lot of people are suspecting that Cell might have absorbed Android 17. Now, granted, that is a huge statement, and we have to have a lot more information before you can even get to that. But the fact that 17 has been such a mystery is a unique thing. So one of the great reasons why Max Cell is an interesting concept is that it can utilize the androids themselves as their characters have been fleshed out more. And if that semi-perfect Cell looking version is what we expect him to be, who knows, maybe he might end up absorbing 18 somehow and becoming perfect, and that will add even more tension to the movie itself. And this leads us directly into our second point, where one of the best things about Max Cell is that it's actually an Earth threat. And what I mean by this specifically is that it's been quite a while since we've actually had an original Earth threat in Dragon Ball. Usually, if you go throughout Dragon Ball Super, it's either in another timeline or another universe or some random alien comes to Earth and causes a threat, or our heroes go somewhere else. But it's been a while since there's been an actual organic threat on Earth that can pose a threat to our actual characters, and that's one of the reasons why the Android arc was so interesting. Dr. Gero used his technology to actually create a threat on the planet itself, which was very different from a lot of other arcs that we'd seen later on in Dragon Ball. Now, when we go on to our next point here, guys, we also have to talk about utilizing other characters. So we talked about the utilization of the androids in our first major point, but now we have to talk about Gohan and Piccolo a little bit more in depth. Now, one of the things here is obviously Pan is a main focus of this, and Gohan is a totally different character than what he was as a kid, which is one of the reasons why this is interesting, because throughout Dragon Ball, we never really saw Gohan in a very paternal-like role. Yeah, we knew he was Pan's dad, but there weren't really that many moments of him showing that protective instinct the way we had seen other characters like Goku display throughout the series numerous times, which is very different for a character like Gohan. And then when you look at a character like Piccolo and the fact that it's possible that this Max Cell might be a kaiju type monster, and Piccolo's great Namekian form might have to clash with him. It really just shows that when you couple that with Cell's other ability and can use all the techniques that our characters have, he's an extremely dangerous villain to fight against. And in the future, you will see another video in the future talking more specifically about how much of a threat Cell actually is. But when you see that Dragon Ball has these large casts, like similar to Resurrection F where there are multiple characters fighting, those are always the most fun, because even if those characters fight against the weaker villains, it still goes to show that they're relevant, as opposed to everybody just sits back as a spectator while Goku and Vegeta are the only two people that can fight against the main villain of the movie. Whenever Dragon Ball creates henchmen that are weaker for our weaker characters, it's always good. Similar to what we saw in the Tournament of Power. Even though they weren't henchmen and they were fighters in different universes, it was awesome to see that the weaker characters of Universe 7 were able to fight against weaker multiversal fighters, which gave them some form of relevance that we hadn't seen in a while. Seeing characters like Master Roshi and Krillin and Tien fight was just something we hadn't seen much on a serious level. And similar to what we saw in the Moro arc, watching those other characters fight can really bring together their collective abilities, especially with all the years of training that they've actually had. And that leads us directly into the next point, where we'll talk about the actual progression of our characters. Now, one of the cool things about Resurrection of F is that we saw a lot of progression in the characters, because when Frieza came back, some people didn't quite like that, but one of the interesting things is that Frieza hadn't seen our heroes in a long time. So Gohan was already grown, Gohan knew how to turn Super Saiyan, all these characters had already had all these interesting techniques. So it was interesting seeing that dynamic where Frieza's not really sure as to the full capabilities of our characters, but our characters are also not fully aware of what Frieza can do, because he's been dead and he's also been training, and we've never known what it would be like if Frieza actually trained. So when you have that kind of dynamic and you have a character like Cell, who might be a totally different Cell, completely original, completely separate from the old Cell of the past, whatever it is, it will be interesting to see how our modern characters would fight against a modern Cell, similar to what we saw with Frieza in Resurrection of F. But the best thing about Cell's return, in addition to the whole android theme as a whole, is the fact that it makes this movie feel extremely personal as compared to other Dragon Ball movies and arcs. And the reason why we're saying this is because if you look throughout Dragon Ball history, the Android arc is the one arc that really had the most character involvement for the minor characters and for the major characters. And let's explain. Gohan is connected to the androids because in an alternate timeline, the androids killed him while he trained the last defender on Earth, and then in the present timeline, he was the one that killed Cell. And Trunks is connected to the androids because he came back in time, and also Trunks himself also defeated the androids in the future in addition to Cell. And even though this is a totally different Cell, this is a totally different Trunks too. There's still that connection of Trunks and the androids. And then when you have a character like Bulma, who in an alternate timeline created a time machine, and then all of these other fighters like Piccolo and all the others that died against the androids, this is a very personal feeling movie. And when you look at a character like Krillin, and the fact that Krillin is now married to one of the androids and then has a brother-in-law who's also an android, and had a kid with an android, and the fact that Goku died in an alternate timeline, so he never actually got a chance to like fight the androids in the future, but then he survived in the present, but then still died anyways. There are so many different connections, especially with Vegeta being the father of Trunks itself. So the best thing about this is that every one of these characters in the past and now has some connection to the androids of some sort in a major way. Even if you look at a minor character like Tien and Krillin, right? Tien held off Semi-Perfect Cell, and if he hadn't done that, they still would have been in trouble anyways if Cell eventually found them, but Tien did hold off Cell so that 18 and 16 could escape. And then when you look at a character like Krillin, outside of having a personal relationship with 18, Krillin himself also made a major decision by not deactivating 18, which would have helped in the fight against Cell. And even looking at a character that no longer exists like Android 16, Android 16 was the character that pushed Gohan into becoming a Super Saiyan 2, and that was all instrumental in everything. So when you factor all of that, and the fact that there was a major beam clash in the end, even though that didn't exist in the manga, that was only anime only, this is a very personal movie, and I definitely think that the interest level of Dragon Ball Super hero, I don't want to say the extra super, is going to be awesome.